A crowd cheered, a pastor prayed, and a man died for a crime he didn't commit. But what if I told you someone captured it all? A single photo that exposed an entire town. If you don't hear this story, you'll never understand how silence can be the deadliest weapon of all. Mississippi, 1932. The night was thick with heat and hate. Cicadas buzzed like the hum of a distant warning, but no one heard it, or maybe no one wanted to. A crowd had gathered under the shadow of the county jail, their faces lit by torchlight, their mouths twisted into something both grotesque and triumphant. "Bring him out," someone shouted. The cry wasn't angry, it was eager, hungry. A rope swung loosely in one man's hand, brushing the dirt as he walked. Children sat on their father's shoulders, eyes wide, watching like it was the 4th of July. A woman passed out lemonade. This was more than a mob. It was a ritual. Behind the iron bars, Elijah Carter stood still, his face bloodied, shirt torn, but his eyes steady, haunted but steady. He didn't beg. He didn't scream. He simply whispered, "Please, tell William to keep the camera safe." Outside, Sheriff Dalton leaned against the wall, arms folded, eyes down. His badge caught the firelight, glinting like a silent witness. He wasn't holding the rope, but he wasn't stopping it either. From a window above, Clara Monroe watched, tears streaking down her cheeks. Her hand trembled as she gripped the edge of the curtain, mouth open in a scream she couldn't let out. And somewhere nearby in the shadows, a 16-year-old boy clutched a boxy camera to his chest. William Carter, Elijah's little brother. His breath came fast, uneven, but his hands, steady as stone. He raised the viewfinder. Click. A flash of light. Then darkness again. The photo would capture more than a moment. It would capture the truth, one no newspaper in town would ever print. But before that truth, there was this night. 3 days earlier, Elijah had been walking home from the warehouse. His back sore, boots dusty, thoughts on supper and sleep. He passed Jacob Morrow's store, same as he did every evening. Only this time, something changed. A crash. Broken glass. "Elijah," a voice accused, loud and sharp like a whip crack. "He did it." That colored boy broke in. Jacob burst out of the store, pointing with a shaking hand that wasn't shaking from fear, but from the thrill of it. Sheriff Dalton arrived minutes later, cuffs already in hand. "I didn't touch nothing," Elijah said quietly. "I was just walking." "You always just walking, ain't you?" the sheriff muttered, snapping the cuffs shut. And that was all it took. No trial, no lawyer, no proof. The town whispered behind closed doors. Some knew the truth, but they said nothing. Because saying something, that meant trouble. That meant choosing a side. That meant risking the comfort of silence. So they stayed quiet. The only one who didn't was Clara, a school teacher, white, educated. She had taught William how to write his name, how to read the Constitution. She believed in right and wrong, or at least she thought she did. That night, she ran to the church, her heels clicking against the cobblestones like a countdown. "Pastor White," she cried, "you have to stop this." The old man looked at her, eyes sad. "Child, sometimes it's best not to interfere. God sees all. He's not the one tying the rope," she screamed. But Pastor White turned away, and Clara, heart pounding, fled into the night. She found William crouched behind a stack of barrels, camera in hand. "Do you know how to use that thing?" she asked. He nodded. "Then don't stop, no matter what happens." The bell of the jail tower rang once, then again, and the crowd cheered. Elijah was led out in chains. No one looked away, except the sheriff, except the pastor, except the people who claimed to be good. But William, he looked straight at the horror, and he captured it. Because if no one remembered what happened tonight, if no one saw it with their own eyes, then they'd keep doing it, over and over. Elijah didn't get to speak his last words to the town, but William did, and he spoke them with a flash. 3 days before the rope burned through the midnight sky, Elijah Carter was just a man heading home. It was a Tuesday, hot, still, with the kind of air that clings to your skin like sweat and judgment. Elijah wiped the grime off his brow as he walked the familiar dirt road past Morrow's general store, a canvas sack of tools slung over his shoulder. He had just finished patching up a fence on the west side of town. Another long day. Another honest dollar He didn't know his life had already been priced cheaper than a broken window. Inside the store, Jacob Morrow leaned behind his counter, puffing on a cigar, eyes narrowed at the door. He'd been stewing for weeks. Business was slow, the bank was on his neck, and he needed a distraction, someone to blame. Someone easy. He saw Elijah through the dusty window and smiled, but not the kind of smile you'd trust. Just then, a crash rang out, shattering glass echoing like gunfire. Jacob grabbed a broom handle and ran outside, eyes wild. "There he is," he bellowed. "Elijah Carter. He broke my damn window." Elijah turned around, confused. "What?" A small crowd had already gathered. That's how fast it happened in towns like this. One scream, one lie, and the dust barely had time to settle before it became a storm. "I didn't even touch your store," Elijah said, raising both hands. "I ain't even stopped walking." Jacob pointed the broom handle like it was a rifle. "He's lying. He's the only one out here." A man from the back shouted, "I saw him passing by. Looked real suspicious. Probably tried to steal something," another muttered. "No, wait, he's always walking this way," someone else offered, but their voice was too soft. Swallowed whole by louder mouths. Elijah's eyes darted between them. "You all know me, but that didn't matter now. What mattered was who spoke first and who shouted loudest." 10 minutes later, the sheriff's car pulled up, tires crunching gravel, door creaking open like the beginning of a verdict already written. Sheriff Dalton stepped out, holster low on his hip, badge shining under the noon sun. He was slow, deliberate, the kind of man who didn't say much, and when he did, it usually wasn't good. "What's going on?" he asked, looking directly at Jacob. Jacob put on his best righteous citizen act. "Caught him trying to rob me. Broke my window." "I didn't touch no window," Elijah said. "I was just walking home." Dalton scratched his chin, then looked at the crowd. "Anyone see it?" Silence. Then a nod. Then another, like a wave of submission or fear. Sheriff Dalton sighed. "Well, guess I gotta do my job." He reached for the handcuffs. "Sheriff, come on now," Elijah said, voice calm but tight. "You know me. I've worked this town every damn week. Ask Mr. Bell. Ask Miss Clara." Dalton paused. Just for a second. Long enough for Jacob to frown. "I ain't got time to ask nobody," the sheriff said. "Now turn around, son." The click of the cuffs echoed louder than the crowd. From the second those cuffs clamped shut, Elijah was no longer a man. He was a suspect. A name on a whispered rumor. A body being marched into history with no one to hold the record straight. William was across the street, watching from behind a wooden post. He didn't say a word, just stared, frozen. The next morning, Clara Monroe stormed into the sheriff's office. "This is nonsense," she snapped. "You've arrested an innocent man." Dalton didn't even look up from his paperwork. "We're investigating." "Investigating?" Clara scoffed. "You haven't even swept up the broken glass." "He was there. Folks saw. Folks saw him walking. That's not a crime." And Jacob Morrow has hated Elijah ever since he outbid him for the church roof repair. Dalton leaned back, arms behind his head. "You're upset, Clara. I get it, but this isn't your fight." "I teach his brother," she said, voice rising. "And I won't sit back while you railroad a man for walking down the street." "Then don't sit," the sheriff said flatly. "But be careful what you stand for." Around here, folks remember, he wasn't threatening her. He was reminding her. Clara left, cheeks burning with fury and fear. That night, the whispers began. "Did you hear? Elijah Carter's in jail. About time. He's not like the others. Too proud. I always thought he looked at my daughter funny." Lies have a way of multiplying once the first seed is planted. They spread like fire on dry grass, and no one dares pour water. Meanwhile, Elijah sat in the county jail, staring at the stone wall. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't ask for a phone call. He just sat, quiet, jaw clenched. The deputy brought him stale bread and warm water. "They're coming for you, the deputy said casually, like he was talking about a football game. "Not sure when, but it's getting loud out there." Elijah nodded slowly. "Ain't the first time I heard noise." The deputy shrugged and walked off. And just outside that barred window, the town began to tremble, not from guilt, but from anticipation. Jacob was seen cleaning his rifle the next morning. Some of the men at the barber shop joked about bringing their sons to watch history. The women baked pies and pretended they didn't hear their husbands whisper. In homes across the town, people locked their doors not to stop the mob, but to keep their conscience quiet. Clara looked out her window and saw two men sharpening a pole. William cleaned his camera lens and tried not to cry. And Elijah sat in his cell, waiting, not for justice, but for the rope that was already on its way. The church on Maple Street stood tall, white, and quiet like a monument to respectability. Its stained glass windows glowed with the soft colors of saints and angels, bathed in the evening sun. To anyone passing by, it looked like a place of peace. But inside, Clara Monroe was anything but peaceful. Her footsteps echoed sharply on the wooden floor as she stormed through the front doors, still in her school dress, hair pulled back tight, fists clenched. She didn't knock. She didn't ask permission. She went straight for the pastor's office, heart pounding. "Pastor White," she called. "I need to speak with you. Now." The door creaked open slowly. Pastor Allen White, a tall man in his 60s with silver hair and tired eyes, looked up from his desk. He had been reading his Bible, a pencil resting in the margins where he liked to underline the gentle verses. He adjusted his glasses, offering a soft smile. "Clara, dear, what's the matter?" "They're going to kill him," she said, voice shaking. "You know that, don't you? Elijah Carter. He's in jail, and there's talk of a mob. No trial, no justice. Just a rope and a crowd full of hate." Pastor White sighed, folding his hands slowly, like he was praying for the right words. "I've heard some things," he said quietly, "but sometimes the best thing we can do is keep still. Let things settle on their own." Clara blinked. "Keep still?" "Yes, child. God doesn't call us to stir chaos. We must trust in his plan. If we act rashly, she cut him off. "A man is about to be lynched, Pastor. Not accused, not suspected. They've already decided. And you're telling me to keep still." He stood up slowly. "Clara, you must understand. I serve this entire town, black and white, young and old. If I take sides, you're not taking a side," she snapped. "You're taking a stand." There was silence, heavy, choking silence. Pastor White looked away, out the window, where the sun was dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows over the graves in the churchyard. "I remember Elijah as a boy," he said softly. "Sat right there in the front pew every Sunday. Smiled like he didn't know the world was cruel." "Then speak for him now," Clara said, "before the world proves it is." The pastor didn't answer. Instead, he walked slowly to his bookshelf, running a finger along the spines of scripture and theology, as if trying to find an excuse tucked between the pages. "Clara," he finally said, "this town isn't ready to hear that voice from me. If I speak, they won't listen. They'll turn on me. On the church." Clara stared at him, stunned. "Then what good is your church?" she whispered. "What good is preaching love if you're too scared to show it?" He winced, but he didn't argue. "You think silence is peace," she said. "But silence is permission. And you're giving them permission." She turned and walked out before he could answer, slamming the door behind her. Outside, the sky had gone orange and bruised. Clara stood on the steps, breathing hard. People passed on the sidewalk, some offering polite nods, others pretending not to see her. She felt like screaming. Instead, she ran down the street, past the grocery store, past the newspaper stand with headlines that said nothing, past the line forming outside the diner, where folks were laughing like nothing was wrong. She stopped only when she reached the small, run-down house on the edge of town where William lived. She knocked once, then again, harder. The door creaked open, and William stood there, eyes swollen, camera still hanging from his neck like a cross he couldn't put down. "Can I come in?" she asked. He nodded, stepping aside. Inside, the house was quiet. A single lamp lit the room, casting long shadows on the peeling wallpaper. Clara sat down, trying to catch her breath. William sat across from her, silent. "I went to the pastor," she said. "He won't help." William looked at her, his face unreadable. Clara continued, voice trembling. "He said it would divide the town, that it's not his place." that it's not the right time. William stood up and walked to the small table in the corner. He picked up a photograph one he had developed himself. It was of Elijah, smiling, sitting on the front steps of this very house, arms around William's shoulders. He handed it to Clara. He used to say, William said quietly, silence never saved nobody but the guilty. Clara felt her throat tighten. She looked down at the picture, at Elijah's smile, then back at William. Then we can't be silent, she whispered. He nodded. That night, the church bell rang for evening service. Pastor White stood at the pulpit, Bible in hand, eyes scanning a congregation that had doubled in size since word of Elijah's arrest spread. They looked to him now not for comfort, but confirmation. They didn't want a sermon, they wanted a blessing, a benediction for their rage. And he gave it. He read from Romans about law and order, about trusting in authority. He spoke of maintaining peace, of letting justice run its course. He never said Elijah's name. Clara sat in the back row, listening. And as he finished, she stood, alone. Her voice rose, sharp and clear. Justice won't run its course if you've already built the gallows. Gasps rippled through the room. Pastor White froze, but Clara didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked out, heels clicking hard against the church floor. The congregation stared, but none followed, because that night, the pastor gave them what they really wanted, a reason not to feel guilty. And Clara? She was done waiting for someone to do the right thing. She would fight, even if it meant fighting alone. The wind had picked up that morning hot and restless, like even the sky couldn't sit still. Dust swirled across the empty streets of Pine Bluff, clinging to windows, to door frames, to the words people were too afraid to say out loud. The town looked the same, but something underneath had shifted, like the whole place was holding its breath. Clara Monroe slammed the receiver down for the third time in 5 minutes. The line was dead. Again, she reached for the rotary dial, spinning it toward Jackson, the county courthouse, the only place left that might help. But the call didn't go through. Static, then silence. She muttered under her breath and tried another number. Nothing. Not even a busy tone. She stormed into the front office of the school, where the phone line was supposed to be protected, used only for emergencies. She stared at the wires running down the back wall. Snipped. Clean. They'd done it. Someone, maybe the sheriff's men, maybe some of the store owners, maybe even the boys from the post office had cut the town's lines. No calls in, no calls out, no law, no press, no rescue. Clara clenched her fists. If they could cut the phone lines, what else were they willing to cut? A few blocks away, William Carter sat in the shadows behind the old barber shop, his knees hugged to his chest, camera gripped tightly in his lap. He hadn't slept. Not really. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Elijah's face bruised, bleeding, quiet. There had been no visitors allowed in the jail, no food from home, no chance to speak. William had tried twice, but the deputy just smirked and told him to go play hero somewhere else. So William stayed low, watching, listening. The mob was building, you could feel it, like pressure behind a dam. Then came the footsteps. 2 men, broad shoulders. One wore a butcher's apron stained with grease and red. The other had a cigarette dangling from his mouth, the ash growing longer as he walked. They didn't yell, they didn't smile. They just stopped 5 feet from William and stared. Got a nice little camera there, the butcher said, tilting his head. William didn't move. You been taking pictures of folks? The other man asked, flicking his cigarette to the ground. No, William said flatly. You sure? The butcher took a step closer. Because someone said they saw a flash last night. From the alley. William's heart thudded in his chest. I didn't see nothing, he replied. The man with the cigarette squatted down to his level. Look, son, this ain't the kind of moment folks like you want to remember. Sometimes it's best to forget. He smiled, but it wasn't kindness. It was warning wrapped in a grin. Some things, he whispered, ain't meant to be captured. He reached toward the camera. William pulled it back. Don't touch it, he said, voice low but firm. The man chuckled. Brave little thing, ain't you? The butcher leaned down. You ever had your hands broken, boy, with a hammer? William didn't blink. You ever had your picture in a courtroom? The words slipped out before he realized. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the last flicker of his brother's courage finding its way to the surface. The men paused. long enough for William to stand. He didn't run. He walked slow, careful steps, camera still in hand, heart beating like a war drum. He didn't look back, but he could hear them laughing behind him, not because it was funny, but because they thought he was already lost. By noon, the square was busier than it should have been. Shops closed early. Men gathered in clusters, hands in pockets, voices hushed. A group of teenagers passed around a length of rope like it was a toy. One carved a name into a plank of wood, Carter. Clara saw it as she rushed past. She wanted to scream. Instead, she ducked into the back door of the post office, where Mr. Harlan, an older black man who had worked mail for 30 years, was sweeping the floor. "Harlan," she gasped, "do you have any backup line? Anything still working?" He looked up, eyes wary. "They cut everything this morning. Took the wire cutters straight off my own hook. I have to get a message to Jackson, or Memphis, or God, anywhere." Her voice cracked. "Elijah doesn't have more than a day, maybe less." Harlan hesitated, then reached under the counter. He pulled out an envelope, unmarked. "I wrote this up myself," he said. "Was gonna mail it tonight on the train run." Slipped it in with the news bundles. "It's going to the Defender." Clara blinked. "The Chicago Defender?" He nodded. "They ran a story last month about a lynching in Alabama. Made the mayor step down. You did this on your own?" "I ain't brave," Harlan said softly. "Just tired of burying boys who ain't done nothing." Clara stepped forward and hugged him. He didn't hug back, but he didn't pull away either. Later that night, William found Clara sitting on the steps of the schoolhouse. "I saw them," he said. "The ones who cut the lines. They came after me." Clara looked up, her face pale, lips pressed tight. "You okay?" He nodded. She touched the camera hanging from his neck. "You still got it?" "Yes." "You get a clear shot?" William hesitated, then said, "3. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "We're going to need all of them," she said, "because the phones are dead. The town's gone quiet. And when the silence gets this loud, it means the rope is ready." William sat beside her. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The sun had gone down, the stars blinked into view, and somewhere across town, someone was hammering nails into wood, a platform, a crossbeam, a place to end a man's story. But William wasn't going to let that story end in silence. The morning light was thin, hesitant, as if it didn't want to touch the town. Pine Bluff had never been so quiet, not because people were asleep, but because they were preparing. Rope had been bought, nails hammered. A crude wooden platform had been erected in the clearing behind the courthouse overnight. No one claimed to build it, but everyone knew who it was for. By mid-afternoon, the air was buzzing, not with music, not with laughter, but with a twisted kind of anticipation. It was a holiday for hate. Mothers packed lunch baskets. Fathers brought out flasks. Some even brought their children. "This one's different," a man said at the barber shop. "He's got a smart mouth. Thinks he's better than us. He walks too proud," someone else muttered. And that was all it took. Not a crime, not evidence, just pride. Pride in a black man was always read as defiance. At 3 o'clock sharp, Sheriff Dalton unlocked the jail cell with a slow, deliberate turn of the key. Elijah Carter sat on the cot, his hands folded in his lap, back straight, eyes clear. "You ready to go?" Dalton asked, not looking at him. Elijah didn't move. "You know they're out there," the sheriff continued, voice flat. "Ain't nothing I can do to stop it now." Elijah finally stood. "You never tried." The sheriff flinched but said nothing. Outside, the crowd began to swell. Clara stood in the shadows near the church, eyes scanning the square. No police presence, no order, just chaos with a smile. She spotted Pastor White standing on the steps of the church, arms crossed, watching. "You going to stop this?" she asked, walking up to him. He didn't answer. "Say something," she demanded. He looked at her, eyes tired. "It's too late." "No," she whispered, stepping closer. "It's too late for you, not for him." They dragged Elijah through the front doors of the jail, like an animal on display. His wrists were shackled, shirt torn, feet bare. Someone threw a tomato. It hit his shoulder and splattered across his chest. The crowd roared. William stood on the second floor of an old boarding house, peeking through the window, camera in hand. He clicked the shutter once, then again. From above, the scene looked almost organized. A platform, a rope, a celebration. People laughed. A man sold lemonade from a cart. Someone played a fiddle. And in the center, Elijah stood like a ghost. Clara pushed through the crowd, breath tight, her hand gripping a folded photograph in her pocket, the one William had given her days ago. Elijah smiling, alive, untouched. Now he looked like a different man, still proud, still standing tall, but there was something in his eyes that had aged decades in days. They brought him to the platform. Sheriff Dalton stood beside it, hands behind his back. He looked like a soldier waiting to carry out orders. He didn't have the spine to defy. Any last words? Someone jeered from the crowd. Elijah scanned the sea of faces. Some he knew, some he didn't. All of them blurred into one ugly, faceless mass. Then he looked up, right at the second-story window, at William. He didn't smile, but he nodded. And William, despite the tears streaming down his face, lifted the camera. Click. A bright flash lit the square. People gasped. Some turned. The man with the fiddle stopped playing. Sheriff Dalton looked up sharply. "What the hell was that?" "Camera," someone yelled. "Up there! Get it!" Men pushed through the crowd, rushing toward the house. Clara stepped in front of the platform. "You're murdering an innocent man," she shouted, voice slicing the air. "You'll burn in hell for this." The crowd snarled. Someone pushed her. She stumbled back but didn't fall. A woman threw a rock. It grazed Clara's temple, and blood ran down the side of her face. But she didn't move. "You call this justice?" she screamed. "This is a circus. This is evil. Shut her up," a man shouted. Sheriff Dalton raised a hand. "Enough." And for a moment, the crowd obeyed. He turned to Elijah. "You want to say something?" he asked. Elijah stepped forward. The rope hung just inches away. "I was born here," he said, voice loud, clear, "worked these lands, fixed your roofs, fed your horses, walked your streets, and I never once raised a hand to any of you." The crowd was silent. "You think I'm dangerous because I stand tall, because I look you in the eye? You think I'm guilty because I don't bow?" He looked at the rope. "Well, then go ahead. Call it justice. But know this." He turned his gaze again toward the window. "Somebody's watching." And with that, the executioner stepped forward. The rope was tightened. Clara screamed. William clicked the shutter one last time, then turned and fled, just as the door behind him burst open. Men stormed the room. Too late. He was gone. Back at the square, the crowd erupted. Some cheered. Some wept. Some just stared, eyes glazed over, unable to comprehend the weight of what they'd just applauded. Sheriff Dalton stood frozen. Pastor White turned away. And Clara, she collapsed, not from the blow to her head, but from the sound of the trapdoor falling open, the sound of silence that followed. It was done. Elijah Carter was dead, but something else had been born, captured in a shutter flash, carried by a boy running through alleyways, and sealed in the eyes of every person too afraid to speak. The pageant of violence was over, but the reckoning? It had just begun. William didn't stop running until the trees swallowed the sound of his footsteps. Behind him, the shouts of angry men faded into the wind. They'd searched the boarding house, flipped over mattresses, ripped open drawers, and smashed chairs, but they didn't find him. They didn't find the camera. Because William had escaped through the back window and disappeared into the woods behind the old train depot, just like Elijah taught him when they were kids playing hide and seek near the river. Except this wasn't a game. He clutched the camera tight to his chest, heart thudding so loud he thought the whole forest could hear it. His knees ached. His lungs burned. But he didn't stop, not until the trees cleared, revealing a flickering porch light in the distance. Clara's house. Clara nearly screamed when she opened the door and saw him covered in sweat, eyes wide, blood on his shirt. "William, I got it," he gasped, pushing past her and falling to the floor. "I still got it." She knelt beside him as he pulled the camera from inside his jacket. The lens was cracked, the casing dented, but the film roll was sealed tight in its compartment, unexposed, intact. Clara took it gently, hands trembling. "You got the shot?" William nodded, barely able to breathe. "Did they see you? They tried?" He looked up. But they won't find me now. She stood, heart racing. We have to get this developed. Tonight. I know a place, William said, sitting up. Mr. Bell's print room at the newspaper. He lets me use it sometimes. Clara hesitated. The newspaper building was just 3 blocks from the jail, and the square where Elijah's body still swung in the dark, watched by the same men who had chased William. But she nodded. Get your coat. We're going now. The print room smelled like ink, metal, and secrets. Mr. Bell had gone home hours ago, and the night editor, half drunk and barely awake, didn't question them when Clara flashed the school district badge and said they were working on a student project. Once inside the dark room, William moved like a soldier on mission. He unscrewed the back of the camera with practiced hands and gently removed the film. Fingers nimble, despite the adrenaline. Clara watched in silence as the images came to life, soaking in chemicals, bathed in red light, ghosts forming on paper, and then there he was, Elijah Carter, standing tall on the platform, the rope around his neck, his face bruised but proud, his eyes looking straight ahead, no fear, no shame. In the background, the crowd, some cheering, some laughing, Sheriff Dalton, arms crossed, and to the left, Pastor White, hands folded, eyes closed, praying not for the condemned but for the comfort of the comfortable. William stared at the photo for a long time, then spoke. This is proof. Clara didn't reply. She didn't need to. They printed 5 copies, then carefully packed the negatives into a sealed envelope. By sunrise, Clara was at the station. The early train to Chicago hissed steam onto the tracks, metal wheels screeching as it came to a halt. She approached the conductor, a young black man with sharp eyes and a kind smile. This needs to get to the Defender, she said, pressing the envelope into his hand. It's life and death. The man opened the flap just enough to see the corner of a photograph. He looked at her, jaw tight. I'll get it there, he said. She nodded, eyes welling. Thank you. He tipped his hat and disappeared down the platform. Back in Pine Bluff, the town began to stir. Whispers of the night's events floated through front porches and general stores. Did you hear someone took pictures? They say a boy ran off with a camera. I heard Dalton's face was in one OFEM. The sheriff didn't say much that morning. He sat alone in his office, staring at the wall, a bottle of bourbon half empty on his desk. He hadn't gone home. He hadn't even gone to see the body, because he knew what he'd see, not just Elijah, but himself. 3 days later, it happened. The front page of the Chicago Defender ran the photo in bold black and white. A southern town's ritual of death, the lynching of Elijah Carter underneath, a full column article detailing the night, the mob, the names, Clara's letter, William's testimony, eyewitness accounts, and most damning of all, the photo. Not blurry, not distant, clear as day, the crowd, the sheriff, the pastor, frozen in time. The story spread fast. Black newspapers across the country picked it up. So did a few sympathetic white editors up north. NAACP branches began to organize protests. There were calls for investigation, for federal response. Reporters came knocking on Pine Bluff's doors. Some townsfolk denied everything. Others, stunned by the image, said nothing. A few, just a few, started to question what they had once believed. And William? He watched it unfold from behind the safety of Clara's classroom window, head low, heart heavy. He wasn't a hero. He was a brother, a witness, the one who didn't look away. That night, Clara sat with him at the kitchen table. I thought they'd destroy the camera, she said softly. William looked up. They would have, but they didn't, she continued, because you didn't let them. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and placed something on the table, a small, bent photo. Elijah, not on the platform, but laughing, sitting in the sun, alive. Some people, William whispered, they tried to erase us. Clara reached out, touching the edge of the photo, but the camera remembers. They sat in silence, the house still, the wind whispering through the shutters. Outside, Pine Bluff looked the same, but somewhere beneath the surface, a crack had formed, and from it, light was beginning to bleed through. 15 years passed. The town of Pine Bluff barely changed, at least, on the surface. The church still rang its bells on Sundays. The sheriff's office still had the same crooked blinds in the window. The square where the platform once stood had been repaved, covered with bricks and benches and forgetfulness. But some stains don't wash out, and some ghosts don't stay buried. On a humid morning in the summer of 1947, a journalist stepped off the train at Pine Bluff Station. She was young, sharp, and northern coat too neat, shoes too clean for a place like this. She carried a leather satchel, and inside it was the headline that had once shaken the country: the lynching of Elijah Carter, photographed by his brother. She walked past the diner, the church, and the general store, now under new ownership. But what she was looking for wasn't on any sign. It was in the silences, in the eyes of the older folks who turned away when she passed. She stopped at the courthouse and asked for Sheriff Dalton. "He passed 2 years ago," the clerk said, barely looking up. "Heart attack. In his sleep." Of course he had. No reckoning, no trial, just a quiet exit, the way cowards often go. The journalist made her way to the edge of town, to the school where Clara Monroe had once taught. It was a library now, and in the back, there was a wall of photographs: pioneers, pastors, war heroes, and one small, unframed print that had been tucked into a corner. Elijah Carter, smiling. No rope, no gallows, just him, as he was. The journalist took out her notebook and jotted down a single line. They tried to erase him. They failed. On the outskirts of Pine Bluff, in a modest brick house with white shutters, William Carter stood in his small garden, trimming the edges of a tomato plant. His hands, though aged, were still precise, still steady. The same hands that had once held a camera with the weight of the world in its frame. He hadn't spoken publicly in years. Not since the article, not since the firestorm. He never wanted to be a martyr or a symbol. He just wanted to live, quietly. But that morning, a letter arrived, typed, clean. From a museum in Washington, D.C. "We are curating an exhibit on American resistance. Your photographs changed the course of history. Would you consider donating the original negatives?" He sat with the letter for a long time. The camera was still in the closet, wrapped in a wool scarf. The lens cracked, body rusted, but the soul of it, what it saw, still burned inside. He opened the closet and took it out for the first time in over a decade. Then, from the drawer below, he pulled out the envelope. 5 photographs. The same ones that Clara helped him print that night. He flipped through them slowly, like flipping through the memory of a wound. Then, he stopped. There was one he had never shared, never printed, never shown. The final frame on the roll. It wasn't Elijah. It wasn't the crowd. It wasn't the noose. It was the pastor, Pastor Allen White, standing just off the platform, hands folded, eyes smiling, not in peace, not in sorrow, but in satisfaction. William stared at it for a long time, then slid it back into the envelope and sealed it shut. Some truths, he had learned, don't need headlines. They just need to exist. That night, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Clara's old rocking chair creaked softly on the porch. William sat in it now, alone. The garden was still, the wind gentle. In his lap was the letter from the museum. He read it once more, then folded it, placing it under the camera. Inside the house, a new generation stirred his granddaughter, barely 10, learning how to work a digital camera. Her laugh echoed down the hallway. "Grandpa Will?" she called. "Can I take a picture of the stars?" He smiled. "Always," he said. "But make sure you capture the light." She giggled, running outside barefoot with the camera bouncing against her chest. William leaned back, eyes to the sky. The stars were faint, but they were there, like embers, like memories, like justice slow to come, but impossible to kill. 3 weeks later, at the exhibit opening in Washington, D.C., a single image hung in the center of the gallery. Elijah Carter, head held high, rope above his shoulder, the crowd behind him. Underneath the frame, the placard read, "The moment they wanted to hide," photographed by William Carter, 1932, donated in 1947, and at the bottom, in smaller print, he was not a witness. He was a resistor. Back in Pine Bluff, the square was quiet again, the benches empty, the bricks clean. But if you looked closely, just closely enough, you could still see the outline of the platform in the concrete. A faint square, slightly darker than the rest, People stepped over it now, unknowing. But it remained, a scar, a reminder, a single ember glowing quietly beneath the surface of a town that once cheered for death, and in some ways still did. Because history doesn't end, it echoes. And sometimes, just sometimes, a camera flashes in the dark, and the silence has to answer. And if this story made your heart clench, if it made you angry, heartbroken, or simply awake, then drop a number 1 in the comments right now. Let the world know you're not okay with silence standing in for justice. Because here's the truth. Injustice doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers. It hides in rituals, in uniforms, and quiet approvals. But the moment we stop looking away, stop accepting that's just how it is, that it is when things begin to change. Your voice matters. Be the witness they never expected.